So, what are examples of these alternative conceptual approaches that try to overcome this binary thinking?
Well, as academics do, I think they try to come up with a nice word to capture some of their, let's say, conceptual innovations. And one interesting one I found is the notion of campscape by an author called Diana Martin. And what she tries to do with that idea of campscape is she links up to a much wider literature on scapes, like local human landscapes from Arjan Appadurai and the warscape from Caroline Nordstrom, that are all trying to overcome the rigid boundaries of what is war and what is not, what is local and what is not. And in her and Diana Martin's approach, she looks at what a long-term refugee camp becomes over time. And she also criticizes that there is not a hard demarcation anymore of what is a camp and what is not the camp, right? Mm-hmm. So that is also, if the binary is the camp as an exclusion and the outside of the camp as, let's say, the normal spatial organization of, citizenship, she calls that into question. With that, she calls into question, or maybe in a similar terms, what is care and what is control, right? In terms of how a camp is organized, but also what is war and what is peace. All these things, they are related to that same sort of binary critique. So what she does with that camp notion is very interesting. She studied camps in Lebanon that have been there for decades already, and that originally started out as tented settlements outside of Beirut. We see similar, examples in Amman, Jordan, and other areas in the region. But over time, that camp not only became sort of normal or a routine space, so people started to build more permanent housing, and the infrastructural development moved along, in time. But also the city proper of Beirut grew to encircle the original camp setting. So the camp became part of the city in a certain way. Mm-hmm. So it was not only embedded within the city in a sense as a camp, but it also became part of patterns by which people literally crossed the boundaries of that camp. Not only some Lebanese started to live in the camp that presented cheaper accommodation, but Palestinian refugees that were from the camp started to live in the city of Beirut because they were able to afford it. So there was this economic, let's say, exchange that took place simply by the camp becoming routine, by the camp becoming much more normal or settled down over time. Still, we talk about camps. So if you read up on those camps in official documents or the government policies of Lebanon or UNHCR documents, they will talk about Shatila camp or Sabra camp and so on and so forth. And that sort of calls up the image of the exclusion site, of the exceptional temporary emergency measure where the UN is supporting people with medicine and food and so on. And they still do, but on the other hand, if you go there, you can walk in there, you hardly see the difference because it's embedded. So that notion of the campscape illustrates that it is not a hard demarcation, it's not a bounded space, it becomes a scape, right? There's a fluidity between the camp and non-camp. Similarly as what Nordstrom does with the warscape, there is this fluidity or this continuation between war and peace that spread over space and time. Right, so, and you can accord all these, let's say, secondary phenomena to that campscape. So the question who is included and who is excluded in terms of being a camp dweller becomes very interesting in that sense, because the Lebanese person that goes into that camp because he or she thinks there are opportunities there may be actually excluded from the camp, whereas the Palestinian refugee may be included in the camp yet still a little bit excluded in Lebanon, the city. And this may change through time, right? And maybe the Lebanese context where she bases her study on is only one example, but if you take this notion of the campscape and let's say the routinization of the camp, or for that matter any humanitarian intervention that becomes protracted over time, is that we see the similar, let's say, tendency to negate the boundaries that come with the emergency measure. So, for instance, in Kenya or in Tanzania or in Uganda, we see the same phenomena.
Okay.
Very applicable to much more wider, let's say, debates on refugee interventions than only the Lebanese context.
Right. And another author who has offered a conceptual approach which can be considered as an alternative to the binary thinking is Sigona. Can you tell me a little bit about
Okay, that's also somebody who coined a very nice term, which he uses campsmanship to toy around with the idea, literally to toy around with the idea, to counter that notion of, let's say, the forced migrant that becomes excluded from citizenship, but in this case becomes included in a form of, a new social spatial organization in a camp. Now, in his work, it is not refugees per se, but these are Roma camps, but it is applicable to a much more wider array of, let's say, alternative inclusion measures that we see in camps, from refugee camps, but also migrant camps like the Calais camp we had until a little while ago, or camps we now see emerge around Greece or Italy. And campsmanship implies or tries to, shift the focus towards what forms of social regulation emerge in that presumed marginal or exclusion site. People then that themselves maybe come up with alternative ways of education or regulation or governance. May not necessarily be recognized as such, but according to his work and a lot of other work, in every settlement that normalizes over time, we see these things emerging. So, with that simple word of campsmanship, there is this critique against that sort of rigid idea that everybody who is in a camp is excluded or becomes marginal or is controlled as a top-down, let's say, naked recipient of aid, and allows to shift the focus to the creative emergence of alternative patterns of governance, really. Yeah.
Right.
There is one of my favorite authors called Michel Ager, and he discusses what he sees as a coming trend, right? So we have this mixed migration. He follows up on that context, and he more or less does away with the strict definition of who is a refugee and who is not, but also with the question who is entitled to access Europe or not, right? He's very anti-borders. But in a particular book from 2016, he dwells on the idea that maybe we should look at those groups of mobile people as cosmopolitans, but cosmopolitans on, let's say, the very poor end. Mm-hmm. So he refers to banal cosmopolitanism, which is also another nice phrase, I would say. An anthropologist trying to make his way in the world. But banal cosmopolitanism in this case implies that people will try to find, alternative ways of accessing areas where they want to go to, seeking opportunities in life, meeting each other on the way, right? So in hotspots like Cairo or in Libya or other places along the Mediterranean or even in South America or arguably in Asia, but I'm less familiar with that context, where they make do. They somehow eke out a living, they somehow speak the language, they somehow find ways to try and access migration paths, and maybe they fail and they go to another place and they do it again. Mm-hmm. But what he recognizes is that phenomena itself, so a growing group of people that live lives like this, trying to to migrate to other areas as cosmopolitans, but on the poor side of things, that itself becomes a new normality. And you cannot grasp them by referring to either forced migration or labor migration or even tourism. All these, let's say, rigid labels come together in that figure of the banal cosmopolitan traveler, which is very interesting because it also calls into question this whole idea of building higher walls to try and keep people out, while the basic understanding of his character, that banal cosmopolitan character, is that they will try anyway, right? It's like the coming, let's say, world citizen, if you will.
Yeah.